Hi, this is Dan Watanabe, and welcome to 2025, and our first episode of the year of Dan's Rants about show business. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the things that happened throughout 2024 and how it's led to the situation that we're in right now. And a big part of the discussion is going to be about Netflix and their most recent. I'm going to say it's a bit of a contretemps, but not really. It is deliberate on their part about releasing the news that they're going to be increasing the amount of input, shall we say, that they have with writers and other creators about making their content a little bit more dumbed down to audiences. And there's been a lot of furor about that. The truth is, Netflix, just like they have been doing for the past year, is just coming up with a perhaps not quite well thought through way of saying they are accepting economic realities and the fact that their whole plan to turn the industry from a five window system to a one window system has blown up in all of the streaming companies' faces. So they have to go back to some way of making profitable material. Now, how does this fit into what happened toward the end of 2024? As we have seen, the industry has gone through rather cataclysmic changes. They had no choice. After 2023 and the series of failed movies from Haunted Mansion to the Marvels to Ant-Man and Wasp to the Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny, it was a reckoning that said this type of tentpole production was no longer going to be 100% profitable. And that's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Because when you make things only for the tentpole mentality, you are absolutely leaving out a lot of your other viewers. And those viewers are bonding toward other other venues. Now, within Netflix itself, how many of you know someone who has a secret confession that they're watching Korean telenovelas, or that they're watching Spanish language telenovelas, or that they're watching more shows from foreign territories? Now, the metrics have never really changed where 1% of content that's viewed in the United States is created and or financed off its shores. About 99% of all viewing that's done within the United States, whether feature films, whether television, whatever, is all based on American money in some form or another, so they conform to American tastes. For a long time, that also worked within the foreign market. But it stopped working because it became not only repetitive, but in an ironic way for a genre, tentpole pictures, that are supposed to be widely appealing worldwide, they became ridiculously America specific, particularly in regard to the focus on American racial strife, on American cultural strife, on American class strife, not at all trying to come up with stories that relate to people around the world, which is why a lot of these tentpole pictures have failed to keep up with the strength in the past. Now, I know people will say, but what about Inside Out 2? What about Wicked? Because these are two examples of things that have, at least on the tertiary side of it, a lot of content in them that makes them seem like they are out of step with a return to focusing on the mainstream America market. But they really aren't. Look at what happened with Inside Out. Disney went in there and deliberately pulled out any direct reference to the fact that this was originally a gay story. And you can even see it in the film as it is now when the main character talks about the deep dark secret. We all know what that deep dark secret was supposed to be. The fact that they came up with a really cockamamie explanation for what it is doesn't matter. It was still enough there. And Disney made the right decision because they realized they were making a movie for a very tiny audience, and they needed, with spending the amount of money they did, they needed to have a slam dunk hit. And they did. Now, what about Wicked? What about all the publicity that surrounds Wicked, hinting that it's a lesbian movie? Well, first of all, it's based on an IP that's 30 years old. The original book Wicked was part of that whole series of retelling of many fairy tales featuring on the villains of said fairy tales, such as Cinderella's ugly stepsister, The Confessions of Cinderella's ugly stepsister, and Wicked was one of those. I read the book when it first came out, and I thought it sounded like it was going to be great, and I really hated it. So I never went to the Broadway show. Yet when I saw the movie, and I'll admit I went to hate watch it, I actually found it to be a really great Broadway adaptation. It is one of the few Broadway adaptations that I can think of that's actually longer than the original show. I mean, when we look at something like My Fair Lady and we think about how it's like watching paint dry, I mean, it's a good movie, don't get me wrong, but it is like watching paint dry because it kept too much of the Broadway show. And film is much more visual. You understand what's going on with the characters because you're seeing reactions up close and personal. But Wicked actually doubled the pace of the original Broadway show, and yet it still worked. I'm going to say it worked in spite of its publicity campaign. And I think it worked because of the legacy of The Wizard of Oz in general, especially the 1939 Judy Garland film. With Wicked, you can even look at it and say, oh, no, 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 this is not an intersectionalist movie about people who are marginalized by society. This is main text in it, and yet have their own talents and succeed. What's not mainstream about that? I mean, we can go back until the 1920s and find stories that are very similar. That's actually one of Hollywood's biggest canonical pieces, is somebody who is an outsider but who ultimately is going to come in and be the rebel, even though it seems to be against everything in their personality. Imagine how you could even do, if I were going for a doctoral dissertation or a PhD, I might even write something like this. I would compare Wicked with Betty Davis movies or Joan Crawford movies, because there's certainly a lot of stuff within Wicked that you could compare to Flamingo Road or Now Voyager. So you actually had a lot of strong stuff going in, plus the fact I don't particularly like the score, but other people love it. So you had a lot of star power in it. So the ads for it, especially with Cynthia Everon just shooting her mouth off all the time. Okay, she's another version of Rachel Zegler, but she actually delivers in a way that's palpable to audiences, and her putting herself out there as almost like a Lady Gaga type figure with her crazy nails and her shaved head and all of that. So she's made herself distinctively different so that you're looking at her rather than listening to her with what she's saying. You're seeing her relationship with Ariana Grande, which is certainly a morally problematic relationship. Which, spoiler alert, I know what happens in the second half. So, and you see how this is actually playing the same way Clueless played back 25 years ago, 30 years ago. So this is a movie that was very mainstream in spite of the fact it's trying to pull out of it. And the reason I've spent so much time on it is you got way too many people in Hollywood saying we need to greenlight more movies about intersectional people. I'm like, no, you don't. Not at that budget level. You got to notice I'm not saying don't make them. I'm saying not at that budget level. This is a $150 million movie. Do not spend that kind of money on something that has a more limited market. Do what Blake Lively did with The End of Us. You have something that's a relatively cheap movie, cost like $30 million, and it makes $300 million. That's the kind of stuff that Hollywood should be looking to make. Something that is cheaper, has a great return on investment, plus is cheap enough where you can make 10 of them for the cost of one Captain America. So you might as well go for having volume rather than being limited. And you're also seeing a lot more very kind of surprising movies that are coming out now, like the new Nosferatu. I haven't seen it yet. I do plan to see it, but and then I'll give a review of it because this is a three make, so it's got a lot of stuff to live up to. But it's also a very daring movie, and it also didn't cost that much. So I think the studios are indeed trying to backtrack. Now let's get to Netflix. We all know that Netflix since 2022 has completely changed its way of doing business. It completely switched around from what it used to be. And that is a good thing. In 2022, the first two quarters were losing quarters. And Netflix knew that this was coming. And the fact that the second quarter lost only 1 million subscribers instead of 2 million subscribers was a win in a way. But they had also changed. Prior to that, ever since the streaming wars started, where every company was trying to outspend each other to make the biggest bling epic possible, whether audiences would tolerate it or not, whether audiences liked the story or not, whether they were even fiscally responsible in the way they were made. And I got friends in post productions who said they weren't. I mean, the fact that my post production supervisor friend said, you know what? I haven't worked on one movie where after the rough assembly was previewed, they didn't reshoot at least half of it. That's ridiculous. What the heck are people doing? What is the development department doing? What is distribution? What is marketing doing if this kind of disaster is still ongoing today? Yes, it does take a while for new methods to come in. Well, guess what? This is 2025, so we're now 3 years out from Netflix changing their plans. So therefore, what Netflix is doing then, what their changes they made then, should have trickled through to things that are coming out now, which it has, but other studios have picked up on it too. What Netflix did for the back two quarters is, first of all, they spent $500 million just to relicense Friends and Seinfeld for regular Netflix, and everyone was shocked at that because, oh, come on, why is Warner Brothers getting rid of this? Another sign that Zaslav is losing his mind? No, it was a sign that Zaslav said this is $500 million that we're making cash, not $500 million we're spending on something that's an if. So that was smart. And there's also some talk about how some of the other things that have disappeared off of Max might be showing up again on Netflix because Netflix has started going out there and licensing content instead of making their own. What happened in the past was that Netflix was licensing approximately a quarter of the money they had. They had $20 billion a year to spend on putting together everything they were going to show during the year. And initially, of course, everything was acquisitions because they weren't creating House of Cards. Everything was either DVDs or the very paleo days of streaming. But here they switched. Instead of doing a 15 billion on making things in-house or buying things from Legendary, A24, and the other companies and immediately putting them on streaming and not allowing a real proper theatrical window, that they were actually burning IP down. They were actually not getting maximum dollar. And plus, you had companies like Legendary, which did Dune and it did the Godzilla versus Kong movies. So you saw Legendary actually being worried that what they were becoming was a very expensive production entity, and that was it. They weren't having any equity state. Well, once Netflix flipped back to doing 15 billion in licenses and only 5 billion or so in terms of new programming that they were in charge of, made all the difference in the world. Because first of all, yes, they're still doing some original stuff, but they can actually spread it out among things like Baby Reindeer. Because you know that one episode the entire series of Baby Reindeer cost less than one episode of Cowboy Bebop, which was one of the series that got Netflix to say, "Oh, we're doing this all wrong. We're not good producers. We're giving up on that particular pipe dream." And they went back more or less to doing a lot of licenses. This was great news for Legendary and A24 because this meant that they could now do slightly different contracts. Yes, if something is not testing well before it's done with production, sure, make it an original. Maybe if it looks like it can win awards, do a tertiary release so that it can get at least nominated. But if it looks good, don't announce when it's going to show up on Netflix yet. Let it play out. Let it be a hit. And then once it's a hit, now all of a sudden, once it comes to Netflix, it's actually even stronger in being able to accumulate new subscribers because now you have a proven title. You've allowed it to play out. Now there's built-in anticipation for people who say, I don't want to go to theaters anymore. So you're actually playing it exactly the way old Hollywood did. So this is a smart move on Netflix's part, and it's been a boon to a lot of these other companies, which were quite frankly saying, "Okay, we're almost done. We're not going to be able to play this game anymore." It's especially with interest rates going up the way they did, we're not able to afford the kind of risk that we've been assuming when money was practically free. And we see that particularly in Warner Brothers, because remember, I know everyone hates Zaslav, but the fact is Zaslav was way ahead in repaying the debt that he had when he acquired Warner Brothers, when he and Discovery acquired Warner Brothers from AT&T, who after 2 years said, "Okay, obviously we've been defrauded, and we're pulling out of this before we lose even more money." And so Zaslav has paid off almost 10 billion of that money. And now they still owe 40 billion. So that's still a ton of cash. So now they're faced with really their interest payments going up to the point where that's 200 million plus movies that they cannot make now. So they're having to leverage their older assets. Whether they can survive, I don't know. I'm hoping they can, because we can't keep losing studios. And Paramount's gone, more or less. I mean, we'll see what Skydance can do. Hopefully, they can resurrect it. Amazon Prime seems to be like Netflix and keeping an eye on what they're doing. Now let's get to the scandal. And this is really irritating to me because clearly one of the most important things about mentorships within the entertainment industry, and this was so true when I entered it. Admittedly, it was 40 years ago, but still, when I entered it, there was still this whole infrastructure that was based on understanding not only the present, but the past. And not only the past, not only the aesthetics, not only why Orson Welles should have won Best Picture for Citizen Kane instead of John Ford for How Green Was My Valley, even though How Green Was My Valley has proven to be a far more influential movie than Citizen Kane. Fight me on that. And yet, that side of it is now gone. And what was great about that is that if you had that backing, if you were like the beginning of the movie, The Player, you were always running around and talking about older movies, talking about other trends, talking about what's been successful, talk about what's been aesthetically successful, talk about what some new trends were. If you were doing that, you were completely focused on being audience driven, about creating things that audiences would want to see. And now we have people who are in those middle management positions who only know the financial end. As my great mentor, Tony Scotti, yes, he was in Valley of the Dolls, and he was also a genius. I mean, he took All American from being a $20 million company when I started in it full time to being sold for $550 million 6 years later on the strength of Baywatch and having strategically been smart and buying the Mark Goodson library when the getting was good. So he was able to leverage that company up that much in that small a period on the basis of one show. Okay, he also had Weird Al Yankovic on the record label, but he was great at that. And one of the reasons he liked me was because I was a trash monger, and I could look at something that was not good and say, well, no, this can be successful because look at all these other movies that have done it the same way, and this movie has this scene in it that works in the ad campaign for it that will get people to at least go opening weekend, and then you can make your money because you didn't spend a lot on it. So, we were all versed in how the business and the art work together. And Tony would always say, and I know he got this from someone else, I don't know who, and someone can correct me, that the problem with show business is people obsess over one of the words and screw up the other. And right now we're in a period where people have screwed up both, which is kind of amazing, but here we are. And what Netflix is doing is Netflix is now going back to those kind of roots where people actually understand how art and commerce must work together. And no, you're not going to change viewing habits of people. And that is what was attempted with streaming, with the idea that now that people have big flat panels, that you can recreate the theatrical experience in the home. So therefore, we need to make things that replicate the theatrical experience in the home. But that's not true because people have not stopped watching media in the home the way they've always watched television, because it's all television, whether it's a $250 million movie that's having its premiere on Netflix or Max or Apple Prime, whatever. Whatever it is, it's still television, which means you're not in an environment where you get sucked into the image, where there are no distractions around you except the irritating pain in the ass person who's looking at their cell phone in the theater, talking out loud, um, just acting like they're still outside of that. You're still in an environment where you get swept in. Plus, the screen is enormous, and so you notice nuance. So, for example, you have a movie like Rosemary's Baby. One of the tricks in Rosemary's Baby is that they used slightly different lenses as the movie went on whenever there was a two shot, where Mia Farrow would be shot with one kind of lens and everyone else would be shot with another lens that was similar but not the same lens. And what it did was it ever so slightly, once you saw it, you knew what they were doing and you thought, oh my God, that was so genius. But what it did was it made you feel uneasy. When you see Rosemary's Baby, even on a flat panel, that level of nuance is not catchable. And so you don't really experience it. Moreover, let's look at actual viewing. What percentage of viewing, of streaming, of YouTube, of all of that is done on your phone? Okay, let's stretch that. Your phone and a tablet, not a computer, not a flat panel display. What percentage? More than 60% is done on your cell phone. Therefore, you're not getting a theatrical experience at all. Moreover, most television, and this goes back to almost 80 years to the 1940s, most television is viewed in a very passive manner. Confess, you're watching something on your TV in your room. Aren't you also checking your TikToks? Aren't you also checking your messages? Aren't you also looking at your emails? Well, maybe not email. I mean, you're not an okay boomer, but you're looking at you're doing something else. If you're at all a part of a family, folding laundry, making food, talking to your relatives, not yelling at the dog, telling the kids, why haven't you done your homework yet? There's any number of things that you're doing while you're watching something that you claim that you are watching as appointment viewing. It's never been appointment viewing. It was always done in the context of casual viewing, where for the majority of people, you're sitting there looking at your TV screen, something visual happens and you catches your attention. Now you start paying attention. You hear something on the soundtrack that sounds interesting and you listen in. So when Netflix says we're dumbing down content, they're actually not. What they're doing is they're accepting the reality that that more people who are watching TikToks and Instagram and YouTube than there are watching streaming programs. And there's a reason for that. And one of the reasons for that is you can do it passively. Not only that, when people accuse people of watching TikTok videos and all of a sudden that being proof that the younger generations are just pathetic. Oh, come on, guys. 2 generations ago, my generation was considered complete wastrels because we wasted all of our time on MTV. Forget about it. That ended up being one of the cornerstones of why we were able to participate in the 80s and early 90s content revolutions because we understood the rhythms of MTV. What today's younger generation have is that they understand TikTok, they understand Instagram. Most of the studio execs do not. They feel that they are beyond it. In the same way that old studio execs thought MTV was just crap. But younger people who are entering the industry now know the truth about Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. And that is, especially in the short forms, that because you watch something that's like a minute doesn't mean that you have a short attention span. Why? How many people have dead scrolled on a on one channel and they've watched one of the person's videos, then they flipped up and watched another, and then they flipped up and watched another. Next thing you know, they spent an hour watching that person's videos. Yes, it's backwards in terms of storytelling because you're usually starting at the present and moving into the past. But isn't that fascinating in and of itself? And what has that led to? It's led to verticals, right? Those are like little telenovelas, where instead of watching a 15-minute episode, you're watching a 1 minute one, which is one scene. And it has all of the drama there that would be in a typical telenovela, whether it be Spanish or Korean or Japanese, where you're getting a very basic story without a lot of characters, but with a huge dramatic and emotional content. So, what Netflix is saying when they're telling their writers, make it more easy for people to come into it without having been narrow focus staring at the screen, because they know, because their research is great, by the way. It's what's made Netflix what it is. And it's one of the reasons why every other company is at a disadvantage. Because even though Netflix had a brief period where it wasn't pretty much the only source and was actually competitive with the others, but they've kept it up since the DVD days. So they have these huge databases that tell you exactly what an audience likes and why and how they consume it and all this other stuff in very great detail. It's not just the title, the year, and the genre and the star. It's a lot more than that. And so they can use that to their advantage. So they're clearly looking at that and they're going, when we look at an episode of Friends, is Friends something you have to actually stare at your TV with? Or could you walk in the middle of an episode, even if you've never seen it before, and almost immediately pick up on what's happening? It's the latter, right? Old television was geared around, through its production design, through its shooting style, through its incessant use of close-ups, which I know doesn't allow it to translate that well to a big panel, so it's much more friendly to watch an old TV show on your phone, in fact. But when you're looking at it that way, you almost immediately, by the reactions, by the attitudes of the way people are talking, often by what their clothing is telling you, whether this is a good person or a bad person. And then when you see the conflict happening, you immediately know what the story is, even if this is the first time you've seen it. And that is what Netflix is going back to. And why wouldn't they? That was a business model that worked at the very least for 70 years. From 1950, from about 1947 through the very early days of Netflix streaming. So well, let's say 2017, because the other streamers didn't start until then. So until that time, you still had this traditional television influence of creating and writing to that kind of audience. You don't think Sex and the City did that? Try to look at some of the old episodes, and you'll see it became very easy to at least paraconsciously decide who was a villain and who was a hero, who was the star of the scene, who wasn't. They had a whole vocabulary there, even on HBO, which was premium, that allowed you to come in at almost any point and in less than a minute kind of be up to speed of what the conflict is and where it was going. So this is not Netflix dumbing down and taking the apple away from great artists. It's merely them saying, we got to go back to doing shows that involve people emotionally. And we can involve people emotionally without using all of the senses. Most television was based around dialogue. Why? Because most of television's history was based on the likelihood of you having a really, really great picture on every single station, and all that was really slight. Even growing up here or when I went to college in LA, USC didn't have cable. So we were using over-the-air antennas, and over-the-air antennas, you either got 5, 7, 9, 11, 13 in the UHF stations well, or you got 2 and 4. So 2 and 4 were always junk. So it had just to do with the atmospherics and all that. So this was the reality of the early days of television, and they accommodated it. This was a reality into the home video era. This was a reality all the way until flat panel TVs became inexpensive, which really wasn't until around the time that House of Cards came out. I mean, I remember buying my first flat panel TV, and it was 10 grand. And there's nothing, and it kind of sucked. It didn't have great quality, and it was a Sony, and it was really a disappointment for me. But this is the truth. Netflix is going back to what the truth is, not what spin is. And if people in the industry can go for truth rather than spin, there's no reason another renaissance can't be coming. I've been through 4. Let this be 5.
I got Stingy, I got Stingy. Whatever Lola wants